The dining room was perfectly appointed. Rosemary sprigs tucked into linen napkins, flickering candles set in symmetrical glass holders, the table runner aligned as though it marked the equator of a world I no longer belonged to. Harper had outdone herself again. Every detail was polished, a performance curated for the benefit of her friends, her husband, her life that orbited a center I had vacated long ago. I sat at the far end of the table. Not by intention, at least not mine. My seat was chosen for me, as they always were now. Placed like an afterthought, adjacent to a fake pumpkin centerpiece, I noticed the faint ring of dried glue at its base. Even perfection had seams if you looked closely. I stared at the seam for most of the appetizer. Conversation rose and fell like tides, but none of it reached me. I watched my daughter speak, hands animated, her hair catching the light in waves that mirrored mine once. Her voice had grown fuller over the years and sharper. I was proud of that. I was afraid of it too. So then I said, "Well, Mom's like background noise now." Harper let out a laugh, too high-pitched, aiming to charm. Her friends joined in like a rehearsed chorus. Chad grinned, the kind of grin that said, "This is fine, this is funny, this is true." Marla, my sister, sitting 2 chairs over, froze mid-bite. She didn't look at me. No one did. The comment wasn't cruel, not obviously. That was the genius of it. It was light, tossed out like a garnish, sprinkled atop her story like cranberries on salad, but it landed with a thud in the hollow of my chest. I didn't respond. I didn't even blink. Instead, I gripped the stem of my wineglass, careful not to tighten too hard. My fingers ached, not from the pressure, but from holding back. Tears gathered, hot and shaming, just beneath my lower lashes. I held them there, suspended like the ornaments Harper would soon place on her perfectly themed Christmas tree. Visible if you knew to look, invisible if you didn't want to. I'd spoken earlier, just a bit. A comment about the weather, a soft joke about overcooked turkey skin. But even then, I'd been interrupted, talked over, gently waved into silence by Chad's anecdote about wine pairings or Harper's update on the twins' reading levels. My words floated, then dissipated, leaving no trace. I remember when Harper was little and everything I said to her felt like water in a dry sponge, absorbed, needed, held. She used to look at me like I was the sun. Now I was a flickering bulb in the corner of her overlit world, still technically on, but mostly irrelevant. It hadn't happened all at once. These things never do. Erasure is a slow art, layer by layer, year by year. At first it was the skipping of my turn in conversations. Then it was forgetting to include me in group texts, planning vacations without asking if I'd like to come, deciding the menu without consulting what I like to eat. Tiny omissions, insignificant on their own, but together they built a wall I could no longer see over. Marla glanced at me finally, her fork idle, her lips parting in what could have been sympathy or regret. But she said nothing. What could she say? That it was cruel? That it wasn't true? That she remembered when I had a voice in this family? Her silence was another layer in the insulation that wrapped around this room, keeping warmth in for everyone but me. I used to believe in the myth of motherhood, that love guaranteed permanence, that being needed would mean being kept. But Harper had grown strong, independent. She didn't need me now, and I didn't fit the aesthetic of her curated world. I didn't match the palette. My feelings were outdated furniture, moved to the attic and dusted off for company, if at all. The irony was that she became everything I wanted her to be. Self-assured, clever, capable of hosting without stress. And yet I hadn't realized that in giving her the wings, I had relinquished my own seat at the table. Not the physical one, though even that now felt symbolic, but the emotional one. The place where you are heard, regarded, woven into the dialogue rather than existing outside of it. I let the wine linger in my mouth. It tasted of cherries and something bitter. Maybe that was me. As the plates were cleared, the laughter swelled again, and I watched them. This family I helped build, this theater I no longer starred in. They were happy, or at least well-rehearsed. And I, the prompter in the wings, remembered my lines but knew better than to speak them. There was a part of me that wanted to rise, to slam the glass down, to say, "I am not background noise. I am the melody you came from." But I didn't. That wasn't my role anymore. Instead, I folded my napkin, precisely, quietly. It was the one thing I could control. When dessert came, a tart with ginger and pear, I complimented it. Harper beamed, pleased. Not because I'd spoken, but because my approval had become ornamental. Another piece in her centerpiece. She didn't hear the silence that followed my words. She never does. After everyone left, I lingered in the kitchen doorway while Harper loaded dishes into the sink. She hummed to herself, unbothered. I watched the back of her head, the elegant curve of her spine, the way she moved like the world bent to her rhythm. She didn't turn around. I considered saying goodnight, or thank you, or nothing. In the end, I walked to the guest room and closed the door softly behind me. Sometimes silence is louder than any voice. Sometimes it is the only thing left when the table won't hear you. Behind Harper's immaculate kitchen, stainless steel appliances gleaming, marble backsplash untouched by time, was a strip of peeling wallpaper, just above the baseboard, near the pantry. No one else noticed it. Or if they did, they dismissed it like a chip in fine china, too minor to matter, too honest to acknowledge. But I saw it, and it undid me. That pattern. A faded rose entwined with ivy, printed in a shade of green that was no longer fashionable. It had once covered every wall of this house. We had chosen it together, Thomas and I, young, naive, debt-heavy, and hopeful, our first home, the one we swore we'd grow old in, which we nearly did. We stripped layers of old paint, sanded floors, fixed the plumbing with clumsy hands and determination. The wallpaper had been our final touch. I remember smoothing it with a brush while Thomas held the ladder, joking that I'd put up with more layers than the wall ever would. I loved those years, even when I didn't know it. Back then, I had dreams too. A small art studio in the sunroom. Piano lessons again, just for me. Mornings reading novels in a chair no one else sat in. But dreams were like fine dust. They collected in corners when you weren't looking. And I wasn't looking, not really. I was watching Harper instead. Every scraped knee, every school paper, every emotion magnified through the lens of motherhood. I thought if I folded myself small enough, quietly enough, I could make room for her to become something extraordinary. And she did. The kitchen now bore no trace of the cluttered chaos that had once lived here. No tiny handprints on fridge doors, no cereal boxes mismatched on open shelves. Harper had scrubbed this space clean of memory, redesigned it into sharp lines and polished elegance. It was beautiful, cold but beautiful. Harper's always been her own compass, Chad said, passing me a dish towel as we dried the wine glasses together. Independent, never needed much guiding. I smiled too tightly. My fingers stiffened around the rim of the glass. That wasn't how I remembered it. Marla, drying silverware beside me, didn't smile. She treats you like a footnote, Audrey. I didn't look up. I didn't want to see her face. I only nodded, the way you do when someone names what you've been pretending not to feel. A truth spoken softly enough to devastate. A footnote. A quiet annotation in the margins of Harper's bold text. Present, but only if you were willing to read closely. I'd been careful not to take up space. I thought that was love, making yourself smaller so someone else could grow. But maybe that wasn't love. Maybe it was just erasure with good intentions. Maybe I wrote myself in pencil all along, I murmured, not expecting a response. Marla heard me. She didn't answer. We moved through the house like ghosts that evening, folding napkins, rinsing dishes, gathering wrapping paper from the twins' craft corner. Harper had asked if I could help tidy while she made phone calls in her office. It wasn't a request, not really. But I didn't mind. I liked doing things with my hands. It kept the ache at bay. In the hallway closet, while putting away extra candles, I found it. A bank envelope, unopened. The flap was unsealed, but the contents still sat neatly inside. A duplicate mortgage statement addressed to Harper. My name was listed in the account holder section, small, below hers. But there. I knew what it was without reading every line. I'd been paying part of this mortgage for over a year. After her divorce, Harper had called, broken and frantic. I had offered help, financial and otherwise. She refused, prideful, embarrassed. But I sent the checks anyway, quietly. Through an account Thomas had set aside before he passed. She never acknowledged them. I never asked. She never needed to know, but she did know. This envelope, left out among unsorted things, confirmed it. Not only had she known, but she had set it up deliberately. She hadn't been overwhelmed. She had chosen not to speak of it, as if my support was not a gesture but a given, expected, unremarkable. I held the paper between my fingers and felt the past curl inward. Thomas and I had spent years fighting to keep our own home. I remembered one winter where we lived on soup and anxiety, afraid of the knock that would mean foreclosure. We had survived it, barely. And now, even in death, he was paying to hold up a house that barely remembered him. I didn't confront her. There was no need. The truth was dull now, worn from too much turning. I folded the statement and tucked it back into the envelope. Let it rest where it had been found. Later that night, Harper praised the pie crust I'd made. She even kissed my cheek, lightly, like a hostess thanking a caterer. It stung more than silence. I looked again at that wallpaper, just a strip, just a memory. But beneath the surface, this house still held me, in its paint layers, its quiet drafts, its fading seams. My hands were in the beams, my breath in the dust. Harper may have redesigned everything else, but the past doesn't peel away as easily as paper, and some dreams, even the softest, leave stains too deep to scrub. The envelope lay on the kitchen table like a held breath. Pale beige, creased at the edges, already opened but still somehow heavy with things unspoken. I had slipped it into my purse while Harper was laughing in the next room, her voice rising like steam from a pot, effortless, unknowing. Now it sat under the yellow glow of my dining room light. My house felt smaller lately, colder, or maybe I was only noticing now. The quiet was no longer comforting, it echoed. I slid the documents out, careful not to bend them. My name was printed cleanly across the top of each monthly statement. Audrey Sullivan, co-signer, co-payer, co-silent, every month for almost 3 years. The amounts were modest by modern standards, just enough to make the difference without stirring alarm. I recognized the figure. It was the exact sum I had taken from Thomas's old account, the one he'd insisted we hold on to, just in case. He died never knowing that just in case would become every month for a daughter who'd once called me the strongest woman she knew. I skimmed each slip. Cold numbers, warmer dates. Harper's divorce had been loud. A dramatic unraveling played out over phone calls and courtroom visits. Her pain had been visible then, raw, human. And I had rushed in, as I always did, a fire blanket smothering sparks. I remembered the trembling in her voice when she told me, "It's not your job to fix my life, Mom." But her eyes had said something else entirely. They had pleaded. And I, too conditioned to resist the familiar pull of duty, had ignored her words and followed the look. Now, in the silence of my own kitchen, I wondered what I had been fixing. Was it her life or my guilt? I'd spent a lifetime confusing the two. When Harper was a child, I taught myself not to want too much, not to ask for space or rest or acknowledgement. I believed love meant never letting her see me tired. I folded my opinions behind her homework schedules, my rest behind her needs. I praised her resilience, even when it masked entitlement. I showed up, always, and when she outgrew needing me, I kept showing up anyway, just more quietly, like a direct deposit no one bothered to thank. I told myself it was love, but maybe it was penance. For the times I was too stern, for the moments I lost patience, for the one night I left her crying because Thomas and I needed to argue behind a closed door. For every perceived failure I logged and replayed. That's what motherhood becomes, sometimes. A careful ledger of regrets, balanced against silent offerings. And what had Harper offered in return? A few dry thanks. A well-meant but perfunctory birthday dinner. The occasional compliment on pie crusts or resilience, tossed like coins into a fountain neither of us truly believed in. And, of course, her most recent declaration, made in a room full of guests. Mom's like background noise now. I had said nothing then. I was too practiced at swallowing emotion. But now, alone, I let the weight sit in my chest. I let it ache. Because it should ache. I looked again at the statements, at my name beneath hers, not above, not beside, beneath. That felt right. I took the envelope in both hands. Its paper was thin, easy to tear. One sharp pull and it split in two, the halves flaring like open wings. But I didn't throw them away. I laid them side by side on the table, as though symmetry could soften the symbolism. What would she say if she knew I found them? You didn't have to. It was your choice. I never asked you, and all of it would be true. That's what made it unbearable. I had made myself small, had squeezed into the crevices of her needs, her ambitions, her silence. I had done it willingly, yes, but not without cost. I traced my name on the bottom of the last slip. The ink hadn't faded, not yet. But even ink on paper wasn't permanence. It could smudge. It could vanish. Much like a woman who'd given everything and asked for nothing, only to be forgotten in the glow of someone else's spotlight. A mother's silence has interest rates too, compounded over time. And while I had been covering Harper's financial shortfalls, my own emotional overdraft had gone unacknowledged. Love, real love, has terms, not monetary but human. Presence, listening, recognition, and she, my daughter, had defaulted. The pieces of the envelope stared up at me, inert but heavy. I didn't regret the money. Not exactly. I regretted the invisibility it bought me, the way it allowed Harper to carry on without ever once having to look back and see the scaffolding holding her up. I gathered the torn halves, folded them once, then once again. I slipped them into my drawer, where I keep old keys and spare light bulbs, things not useful, but not quite ready to discard. Not yet. Outside, the wind stirred leaves across the porch. Somewhere in the house, the heater kicked on, rattling slightly. I stood and made myself tea, jasmine, soft and fragrant. Thomas used to say the scent reminded him of spring. I cupped the mug between my hands and let the warmth bleed into my palms. Tomorrow, Harper would call, or maybe she wouldn't. Maybe she'd send a picture of the twins, smiling in outfits I hadn't picked, living lives I was allowed to witness but not touch, and I would smile. I would say I was proud, because I was. But I would also remember this night, the paper, the numbers, the truth of it. No more fixing, no more silent offerings wrapped in guilt. From here on, only what is asked. Only what is earned. Some debts I've decided will remain unpaid. The house stood where it always had, but smaller now, somehow reduced by absence. Time had worn the edges soft, but the bones were unmistakable. I parked across the street, not daring to pull into the driveway. It wasn't mine anymore. It hadn't been for years. It was the house Thomas and I bought when Harper was 7, after he got the promotion at the firm, and I gave up my part-time work to make more room for stability, as he put it. We planted rose bushes out front, painted the porch twice, argued over the right shade of blue for the door. I chose the softer one. He gave in, eventually. He always did when it mattered to me. A for rent sign swung lazily from a post in the yard, a pale orange maple leaf clinging to it like a secret. I got out of the car and stood on the sidewalk, letting the wind lift my hair from my neck. The kitchen window stared back at me, blank, reflective. That was where I used to stand in the mornings, watching Harper chase the school bus with one untied shoe. She'd wave at me, hand flapping wildly, even if she was late, even if we'd argued over cereal or missing homework. That window had been a frame for so many small, vital moments. I didn't realize I was crying until I felt the wind cool the wetness on my cheek. "Can I help you?" The voice startled me. A woman in her late 50s approached from the neighboring driveway, smiling without suspicion. She held a leash in one hand, a small terrier sniffing at her feet. "No," I said, quickly wiping my face. "I used to live here. I just felt like seeing it again." "Oh," her smile widened. "That's lovely. I'm Cynthia next door. Been here 12 years. You must be Harper's mom." The name landed like a knock on a bruise. "Yes, Audrey." Cynthia offered her hand, which I took. Her grip was warm, firm. "Your daughter's told me a lot about you," she said casually. "She lived here for a while after her divorce, right? I remember the twins playing in the sprinkler." "She did." My voice thinned. "I always thought it was so generous," Cynthia added, tugging gently on the leash as her dog sniffed toward a hedge. "Letting her live here after you and your husband. Well, after you moved out." I didn't correct her. I didn't say that I hadn't just moved out. I had given it up. After Thomas died, the mortgage became a weight I could no longer carry. Harper was drowning in custody filings and child support negotiations, and I'd stepped aside. Quietly. Permanently. "I gave up my home so she could keep hers," I said, mostly to myself. Cynthia's brows furrowed, uncertain whether it was a confession or a boast. Before she could speak, I added, "It was the right thing, at the time." I could still hear Thomas's voice in my memory, low and unyielding from the hospital bed. "Don't let her become you." He said it with tenderness, but it stung like reproach. I knew what he meant. He saw how I had spent decades softening myself, giving away space until there was barely any left. He wanted Harper to be different, sharper, boundaried. She had become exactly that. She's very confident, Cynthia said, as if tiptoeing into safer territory. At a brunch a while back, she mentioned how hard it was dealing with family sometimes, said something about you being, what was it? Cynthia paused, scanning her memory. Oh, an overstepper who doesn't understand boundaries. My breath caught. Cynthia winced as the words left her, realizing too late what they were. I'm sure she didn't mean it that harshly. You know how people vent in safe spaces. It's fine, I said, my tone a touch too even. I swallowed. She's entitled to her feelings. But the words stuck like thorns. An overstepper. I who had stepped back so many times I could barely remember where I used to stand. I who had paid her mortgage in secret, given her my home, my time, my quiet. I imagined Harper, sipping wine in this very neighborhood, among women like Cynthia, casually drawing a boundary against the shape of me, shrinking me into something burdensome, embarrassing. That was the thing about love as I had practiced it. It didn't always register as love to the receiver. Sometimes it looked like meddling. Sometimes it sounded like guilt. And sometimes it disappeared so thoroughly it could be rewritten into a flaw. Anyway, Cynthia said, shifting, I didn't mean to upset you. You didn't, I smiled. Thank you for telling me. It's good to know how people see you, even when it's difficult. She looked relieved, though still uncertain. We exchanged goodbyes, and she returned to her house, her dog trotting behind her without a care. I stood there a while longer. The wind tugged again at the for rent sign. I looked back at the window, the one that had once reflected so much joy and mess and hope, and now showed only sky. The home we built was gone, but its bones had held so much. Birthday songs, flu seasons, late-night whispers, the scent of Thomas's aftershave lingering in. The hall. It had held me, until I'd let it go for someone who no longer remembered, or maybe chose not to. Harper would never know what it cost, or if she did, she would deny that she'd asked for it, and perhaps she hadn't. Perhaps I had given too much without asking what she needed. But still, it had been love. Even if it hadn't looked like it. Even if it had, over time, hardened into resentment from her side and sorrow from mine. I turned back toward the car. I didn't need to see more. The house had spoken, and I had heard it clearly. Some homes are built on blueprints, others on bones, and mine had been hers. The office was too cold, and the air smelled faintly of toner and lemon-scented cleaner. Audrey sat across from the desk, hands folded in her lap, not trusting them to stay still otherwise. Dennis Maddox, financial advisor, former IRS analyst, and self-declared straight shooter, clicked through files on his monitor without looking at her. Found it, he muttered, tapping a key. The mortgage record and subsequent refinance. Let's walk through this like adults. Audrey didn't flinch, but her spine went rigid. Go ahead. Dennis was all sharp lines and sharper words, mid-60s, with silver hair that refused to play along with combs. He wore honesty like armor, the kind of man who believed sugarcoating was a form of disrespect. Original property held in joint ownership, he began. You and your late husband as co-owners, passed down clean to you when he died. That's all fine. But here, 4 years ago, your daughter refinanced, removed your name from the title, added herself. The application includes your signature. She blinked. I never signed anything. Dennis turned the monitor to face her. Then this isn't your signature. The PDF on the screen was crisp, a document she'd never seen, signed with a looping, practiced version of her name, close enough to pass, not hers. I see, she said softly. Dennis gave her a long, unreadable look. Most folks would have been louder by now. I've had louder days. Her voice was calm, too calm. He leaned back in his chair, temple pulsing behind square glasses. This wasn't just a refinance, it was a strategy. Rates were lower then. She consolidated debt, pulled equity out, paid off some legal fees. Based on the numbers, she did okay financially. So she used my home as leverage, Audrey said, each word deliberate. And your name, Dennis added. This is forgery, not just bad manners. If you wanted to pursue it legally, no. She held up a hand. Not yet. He nodded once as though he respected that. You don't need revenge, you need clarity. That line landed hard. It wasn't absolution, it was something more dangerous. Permission to see clearly. Audrey stared at the screen again. The signature glared back. Hers, not hers. An impersonation of trust. She thought of all the years she'd been told she was needed, then dismissed as interfering. The invisible contributions, the whispered labels, overstepper, footnote, background noise. She drew in a breath. It was never just the money. It was the erosion of something fundamental. Her presence had been accepted only when it was useful, when it made problems disappear, papers get signed, debts quietly cleared. She'd written herself into the margins of her daughter's life, believing it was selflessness. But this wasn't just miscommunication, it was extraction. Harper hadn't asked, hadn't offered explanation. She had taken and reshaped the story. Dennis shut the monitor off. You want to talk options? No, Audrey said. Not today. She stood, brushing invisible dust from her coat sleeve. Her movements were measured, but her mind moved faster. Decisions were forming, not in anger, not in haste, but in finality. At the door, Dennis said, Whatever you decide, do it for yourself, not for her reaction. That's the trap. She paused. I know. I've lived in that trap long enough. The sky outside had shifted while she was inside, now a dull gray blanket pressing low over the city. Audrey walked to her car without hurrying, each step a quiet assertion. She sat behind the wheel for a long moment, keys resting in her palm. So many years, she had mistaken endurance for grace, mistaken sacrifice for love. And while those things had value, they had boundaries too. Lines she'd failed to draw for herself. Harper had crossed them, once, twice, repeatedly, and now definitively. Forging her name was not just an act of desperation, it was a declaration. You are convenient, not sacred. The realization didn't hollow her, it clarified her. Harper would continue to thrive, bold, unrepentant, self-assured. But Audrey would no longer be the silent engine behind that trajectory. The unsung scaffolding, the names scribbled on a page for convenience. No more background noise. She gripped the steering wheel. For years she had stayed quiet to keep the peace. But what peace? The kind that meant being erased in slow increments? The kind where love looked like servitude and gratitude was a ghost? No, that contract was void. Harper had drawn up her terms. Now Audrey would draw hers. She started the car. The chairs were mismatched, some with squeaky legs, others too low or too soft, but they formed a loose circle beneath the amber library lights. The women's group met every second Thursday in the community room, past the reference shelves and just left of the periodicals. Audrey had passed the flyers before, never considering they might be for her. Until now. Ruth sat at the head of the circle, not because anyone put her there, but because she made space wherever she went. At 74, with a cascade of silver curls and bracelets that jingled like gentle warnings, she carried herself like someone who had earned every inch of her voice. I spent 40 years whispering, Ruth said, smile sharp and unapologetic. Never again. The words struck something inside Audrey. Not a spark, but a tremor. Whispering. Yes. She knew that language well. The quiet deferrals, the softened opinions, the invisible gifts. They were here tonight to write. That was the theme. Not polished essays or marketable memoirs, just truth, in longhand. Ruth handed out notebooks, velvet-covered, soft to the touch. Audrey's was plum-colored, and she ran her fingers along the binding before opening to the first page. Her pen hovered. So many years spent not writing things down, not naming them, not believing they had weight outside her mind. She pressed the tip of the pen to the paper. Not loud, just real. She underlined it once. The room rustled with pens scratching, occasional laughter, a few tears. The hum of honesty, unpolished and brave. Audrey wrote slowly at first, her thoughts stiff, shy, then a little faster. She wrote about the house she lost, the mortgage she paid in secret, the kitchen window she once stood at like an altar. She wrote about the silence she wrapped herself in and called love. When the session ended, she didn't want to leave. Ruth approached, balancing her thermos of chai in one hand, notebook tucked under the other. You've got steel in you, she said. I can tell. Audrey offered a small, surprised smile. I don't feel like steel. You don't have to feel it to be it, Ruth replied. Most of us were forged in someone else's fire. Doesn't mean we didn't come out solid. They stood in the hallway, coats draped over their arms, the autumn air slipping through the glass entrance. "I'm glad I came," Audrey said. "I'm glad you stayed." Ruth's eyes, sharp but kind, lingered. "Can I share something with you? Off the record?" Audrey nodded. "I know your daughter's husband, Chad." Ruth's voice didn't shift much, but something under it grew heavier. "We have mutual contacts. Finance world. He's been nosing around for months, trying to cash out home equity on that house your name used to be on. Word is, he's pushing Harper to finalize it by year's end." Audrey didn't move, not outwardly, but inside the ground recalibrated. "You're sure?" she asked. "Sure as I am that men like him see women like us as placeholders until something bigger comes along." Audrey looked past Ruth, out the window to where cars idled at the light, taillights glowing like small, patient warnings. So Chad wasn't just smiling through dinners and enabling Harper's dismissiveness. He was orchestrating things, quietly, strategically. And Harper? Was she complicit or simply swept up? It didn't matter. Not anymore. Not to Audrey. "I don't want revenge," she murmured, echoing Dennis's words. "I want clarity." Ruth nodded, slow and solemn. "Then get it, and keep writing. It'll keep you honest." That night, Audrey sat at her kitchen table, tea steeping beside her, and opened the velvet notebook again. Her handwriting was steadier now, less like a visitor, more like a voice. She wrote about boundaries she hadn't known how to set, about a daughter raised with all the softness she herself had been denied, about mistakes she made while meaning well. She didn't absolve herself, but she didn't condemn herself either. She paused only once, to reach into the drawer where she'd kept the torn mortgage envelope. She didn't need to look at it. She just needed to know it was there, not as proof of wrongdoing, but as reminder of how far she'd come, of what wouldn't happen again, of who she was becoming now, real, not loud, present, not passive. She capped her pen and leaned back. The silence in her house was no longer a void, it was space, and she finally had room to hear herself. The screen flickered as the search loaded, each transaction emerging like a tide returning debris. Audrey sat at the dining room table, back straight, reading glasses perched low on her nose. Her old bank archives, painstakingly retrieved after a morning on hold and a quiet request laced in polite insistence, were now open, dated, irrefutable. She began scrolling, methodically. $1,273.48, mortgage transfer, Harper $840, legal retainer assistance $3,200. Emergency payment during custody proceedings, $1,560. Roof repair, $4,090. Property tax default, $2,225.50. Credit consolidation, in Harper's name from Audrey's joint account, and on, for nearly 4 years. The total landed just north of $78,000, some of it indirect, some of it monthly, but all of it quiet, invisible. There had never been a thank you, not once. Not in the form of a card, not a voicemail, not even a passing mention, not even after Audrey had seen Harper redecorate the twins' bedrooms or return from a weekend spa trip with friends. She hadn't done it for acknowledgement, not at first. But something inside her now recoiled at the absence of it, the way it had become expected, absorbed into Harper's new normal. Audrey clicked print. Page after page issued from the printer beside her. Each receipt a thin slice of time, a whisper that said, "I was there. I was helping. I mattered." She stapled them neatly. 3 staples per packet every 20 transactions. The stack grew until it stood nearly 2 inches tall, simple white paper with the weight of years behind it. There was no note attached, no preface, no explanation. Just truth. Tangible, numbered, documented. That afternoon, Audrey drove to Harper's neighborhood. She parked by the curb, engine idling. The leaves skittered across the street, and the sky threatened rain without delivering. She stared at the mailbox for a full minute before stepping out. She slid the envelope, thick, clean, anonymous, into the slot. It didn't need her name. Harper would know. Audrey didn't wait. She turned back to her car, door closing with a muted click. Marla called that evening. Audrey could hear it in her voice before the words landed. The waver, the breath held too long. "She found it," Marla said. Audrey said nothing. "She's upset. I imagine she is. She says it felt punitive. Audrey took a sip of water before answering. It wasn't punishment, it was fact. There was a silence. Marla hesitated. Then softly, "You know your love has always been currency, right?" Audrey's jaw tightened. You give and expect nothing, but you still mean something with it. Every dollar, every casserole, every silence. You've always traded support for closeness. "I don't want closeness anymore," Audrey said, her voice steady, stripped of ornament. "Not at that price." Marla was quiet, not in disagreement, just in grief. "I'm not angry," Audrey added, "but I'm done pretending my giving doesn't have weight, that it doesn't cost me anything." More silence. Then Marla said gently, "She's your daughter, Aud." "She was," Audrey replied, "but I don't recognize her anymore, and maybe she never really saw me." Another long pause. "I tried," Marla said. "I know," Audrey said, softening just an inch, "and I love you for it." But that love didn't extend in the same direction anymore. Not toward Harper, not in the way it used to. Audrey looked at the velvet-covered journal on the table nearby. The last entry ended with a line she hadn't let herself speak out loud, until now. "Let them be uncomfortable. I've lived there long enough." She picked up the pen again. No more invisible math, no more softening truth for the sake of harmony. This was her ledger now, and it was hers alone to balance. The message came at 6:03 a.m., while the sky still carried that pre-dawn hush. Audrey was in the kitchen, waiting for the kettle to sing, when her phone buzzed on the counter. "Chad, you're hurting your daughter. This is beneath you." She stared at the screen. No good morning, no acknowledgement of the silence that had widened between them. Just accusation wrapped in faux concern. As if dignity were only respectable when silent. She didn't hesitate. She typed back slowly, deliberately, letting each word land like a clean break. "Audrey. She's not a child. She's a debt collector in heels." She hit send before her tea finished steeping. There were no follow-ups, not from Chad, not yet. Audrey sat at her desk later that morning, her breath calm, her spine upright. She pulled up every account, banking, utilities, any payment thread still tied to Harper's name. They'd been small things lately, lingering. Autopays no one remembered but always counted on. One by one, she shut them off. Click, Harper's cell phone bill. Audrey had been covering it since the divorce. Just for a few months, Harper had said at the time. 37 months later, it's still auto-deducted like clockwork. Click. School fees for the twins. Field trip donations. Aftercare deposits. Click. Click. The mortgage she wasn't supposed to be tied to anymore, but whose partial payments still came out of Thomas's legacy fund. She froze the transfer, disabled the sweep. A final click closed the tab. She exhaled. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like honesty. For the first time in years, Audrey sat still without waiting for someone else's needs to call her name. That evening, she opened the old metal box from the hall closet. Inside were years of forgotten relics. Dog-eared school photos, cards with finger paint smears, VHS tapes in cracked plastic sleeves. She pulled one free, no label, just a Sharpie-smudged heart. In the living room, she set it into the dusty VCR, the one she never quite got rid of. The screen buzzed, then flickered to life. There was Harper, small and bright-eyed, her curls bouncing as she ran toward the camera. "Mommy!" she yelled, giggling. "Up!" The camera jostled as Audrey, her own voice young and full, laughed and scooped her into a hug. Harper clung to her, arms like vines around her neck, cheeks pink from play. Audrey watched herself sway back and forth on the screen, humming something soft as Harper pressed her face into her shoulder. The frame froze briefly, VHS stutter, leaving Harper mid-cling, her eyes shut in total trust. A freeze frame of need. Audrey's lips trembled, but she didn't cry. "She used to need me," she whispered to the flickering screen. "Now she deletes me." She turned off the TV, let the silence settle. The call came 2 days later, mid-afternoon. Audrey almost didn't pick up. Harper, she let it ring once, twice. On the third, she answered. "Mom!" Harper's voice burst through, tight, panicked. "Did you cancel the mortgage payments?" "Yes." There was a pause, then a sharp exhale on the other end. "It bounced. I didn't know. Why would you? I'm not a co-owner, Harper. Not legally, not emotionally. And I never agreed to fund your life indefinitely. But why wouldn't you at least tell me? I stopped telling you things a long time ago. You never really listened. God, Mom, Harper snapped. You don't understand what this puts me in the middle of. No, Audrey said, her voice level, crisp. You don't get to call now and ask for understanding, not after forging my name, not after making me a ghost in your own home, not after calling me an overstepper to brunch friends. There was nothing but shallow breathing on the other end. I supported you for years, Harper, without resentment, until you turned that into expectation. I didn't mean, but you did, Audrey said quietly. That's the part you can't walk back. A long silence. Audrey could almost hear her daughter's thoughts scrambling, bruising themselves against the walls of consequence. I don't know what to do, Harper finally said. I know, Audrey replied, not unkind. And that's not my problem anymore. She didn't wait for a goodbye. She ended the call. She sat for a long time after, then turned once again to her velvet-covered journal. The next page was blank, but not for long. The cafe was all glass and steel, overly modern, uncomfortably bright. Conversations floated in bubbles around them, punctuated by clinks of cutlery and the soft whoosh of the espresso machine. Audrey chose a table near the window, not for the view, but for the transparency. Harper arrived 6 minutes late, draped in structured wool and apology. She looked tired beneath her makeup, brittle at the edges. She offered a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Thanks for agreeing to meet, she said, setting her phone face down on the table like it might otherwise betray her. I wasn't sure you'd answer. Audrey sipped her tea, her expression unreadable. It's public. You like control. I like safety. Neutral ground. Harper winced, but didn't challenge it. Look, she began, hands folded tightly. I know you're angry, but I don't understand. Why now? Why after all these years of just being there? Audrey set her cup down with care. Because background noise learns how to silence the room. The words landed without force, but their shape left a bruise. Harper blinked, her jaw tightening. It wasn't meant to be cruel. That comment, Thanksgiving, it was a joke. No, Audrey said calmly. It was a truth you'd made peace with, and I hadn't, until now. The silence stretched, not awkward, just dense with everything unspoken. Harper leaned forward, voice lowered. This whole thing with the mortgage, pulling support without warning, calling me out with receipts like some accounting ambush, it's not you. I don't even know who you're trying to be. I'm not trying, Audrey replied. I'm remembering. Harper exhaled sharply. You don't get it. If we lose the house, Chad will leave. He said as much. This isn't just about me anymore. There it was. The angle. The soft weapon. If he leaves over a house, Audrey said evenly, then let him. Let's both stop clinging to the wrong men. Harper's breath caught. Audrey continued. I stayed with your father long after I should have walked away. Not because he was cruel, but because he made me feel small while asking for more. You married the same man in a sharper suit. I paid to keep your life whole. I won't keep doing it. To save you from what you've chosen. Harper's hands were trembling now. You don't understand. I'm trying to hold this family together. You're trying to hold your image together, Audrey corrected, her voice still calm. There's a difference. Harper looked away, out the window, blinking rapidly. I've filed for deed reclamation, Audrey added. I submitted the forgery evidence. You'll be served within the week. I'm transferring the house title back under my name. Harper's gaze snapped back to her. You wouldn't? I already did. The color drained from Harper's face. You said you didn't want revenge. I don't, Audrey said, rising slowly. I want boundaries and accountability and my name back, where it belongs. She gathered her coat, smoothing the sleeve with care. Harper stayed seated, stunned into stillness. Don't do this, Mom, she whispered. Don't become someone else. Audrey looked down at her, eyes soft but resolute. I'm not becoming anyone. I'm returning to myself. She left without looking back. The cafe door closed behind her with a muted hush, the kind only background noise could ever make when it decides, at last, to walk out of the room. The letter began on heavy cream paper, Audrey's favorite kind, the kind that made ink look intentional. She sat at her dining table, the soft shuffle of the neighborhood outside her window, and let the pen glide without hesitation. Harper, you edited me out. I reclaimed the narrative. That sentence had waited years to be written, not shouted, not pressed between teeth, but given form, simple, declarative. A boundary in script. She wrote about what it felt like to disappear in plain sight. About hearing her own worth whittled down to errands and bank transfers. About the silence she'd chosen out of love and the silence she now rejected out of self-respect. She didn't scold. She didn't plead. She didn't even ask for understanding. Instead, she named the things neither of them had said aloud. Love isn't quiet. Silence isn't safety. Distance isn't betrayal. These are things I've learned too late, and maybe that's okay. She paused, watched the wind bend the trees outside. There was a time when you clung to me like I was oxygen. Now you recoil as if I'm interference. That arc was mine to witness, but not to change. I see that now. The pen didn't shake in her hand. Her heartbeat stayed even. You thought I couldn't reclaim myself without punishing you. But this, what I'm doing, it's not punishment. It's a reckoning, for both of us. She signed her name without flourish, folded the letter in thirds. But she didn't reach for an envelope. Instead, she walked to the back bedroom, her storage room now. She opened the drawer of an old dresser, the one she'd given Harper years ago as a housewarming gift. It had been returned to her after the first move, dusty and ignored, but intact. Behind the mirror mounted above it, she slipped the letter. No one would find it unless they looked for it. But it existed. That was enough. Ruth came by that evening, her coat smelling faintly of cardamom and rain. She didn't knock, just let herself in the way old friends do when they've moved past the need for performance. Audrey handed her tea. Ruth glanced at her face and said nothing for a while, just sat with her. When Audrey finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. I wrote her a letter. I didn't send it. Ruth nodded slowly. Good. Don't mail it. Live it. Audrey met her eyes. That's the plan. Ruth smiled, not triumphantly, but with quiet approval. Later that week, Audrey returned to the bank. The refunded portion of the mortgage fraud, processed quickly after the court accepted her evidence, sat in her account like a strange inheritance. Unearned but rightfully hers, she withdrew part of it, not for herself, not for Harper. She filled out a donation form online for a local women's housing shelter, requested the gift be made under the name Harper Sullivan, her daughter's maiden name, the one she was born with, the one untouched by marriage or manipulation. She left no contact information, no return address. The confirmation page appeared, crisp and clean. Audrey took a screenshot, then deleted it. Some offerings were not about legacy, some were about letting go, and she was ready. The walls of the shelter's community room were chipped, but bright, painted with donated lavender, punctuated by bulletin boards lined with poems and promises. Audrey stood at the front, a folder of writing prompts in her hands, and a dozen folding chairs arranged in a gentle crescent before her. Her first workshop. There was no podium, no need. She introduced herself not as a former teacher, not as a mother, not as someone defined by another's proximity, but simply as Audrey. A woman who once forgot how to speak for herself and who now invited others to remember. Most of the young women were quiet at first, skeptical, wary, but they stayed, and they wrote. By the second week, they shared. That evening, a soft-voiced girl named Greta stayed behind after the others had left. 19. With a storm in her eyes she didn't try to hide, and sleeves pulled tight around her hands. You said in your first session that someone gave money so we could keep the new beds, Greta said, tucking her hair behind her ear. That was you, wasn't it? Audrey smiled faintly. Does it matter? Greta held her gaze. It does to me, because if you hadn't, I'd still be with the guy who broke 2 ribs and told me it was love. Audrey didn't flinch, didn't blink away. She nodded. Then I'm glad you're here. Greta reached into her bag and handed Audrey a folded sheet of paper. A poem, titled Exit Wound. She walked away without waiting for feedback. Audrey unfolded it carefully and read every word. That night, Audrey returned to her apartment. Her apartment, not a stopgap, not a downsized echo of something bigger. A place of her own making. The walls were no longer beige. She had painted them herself. Muted green in the kitchen, a bold gold in the hallway. The bedroom held books and stacked crates and plants that leaned into the window light like they trusted it would return. The dining table was no longer a battlefield of bills. It was set with mismatched ceramic mugs and a vase of fresh eucalyptus. On the entryway wall, she had hung an old photo of herself, 28, flushed, beaming, paint smudged on her cheek from the day she and Thomas finished their first nursery. She didn't frame it for nostalgia. She framed it for proof. She had been vibrant once. She still was. She opened her journal and wrote slowly, reverently. I muted the mortgage, but I finally heard myself. She paused. I was never just support. I was never just scaffolding. I was the structure. I am the house I built. In the days that followed, Audrey filled her space not with guests, but with presence. She hung wind chimes by the balcony and let them sing into the afternoons. She hosted friends from the shelter for coffee, for writing, for silence, when that was all they had to offer. Marla came once with a basket of apples and the apology in her eyes. They didn't speak of Harper. They didn't need to. Ruth stopped by often, calling it her creative recalibration stop. She brought baked figs and hard truths. She asked Audrey once if she regretted any of it. No, Audrey had said. Not even the silence. It got me here. She kept the velvet-covered notebook in a drawer now, nearly full. Every entry was a floorboard, every sentence a beam, and the roof, her roof, was held up not by resentment or longing, but by her voice. Firm, real. Audrey no longer needed a return address. She had arrived. The table was smaller this year, round and honest. It didn't gleam with curated symmetry or whisper of expectations. It bore mismatched plates, thrift store glasses, and a centerpiece made of wild sage, apples, and 2 bent candles Greta had insisted on lighting anyway. Audrey set the final dish, a roasted root medley dusted with rosemary, between Ruth's famous sweet potato pie and Marla's overly salted stuffing. They were laughing already, arguing over which decade had the worst fashion, their voices layered and unapologetic. Greta slouched in her chair, napkin crooked in her lap, the youngest at the table by decades but carrying herself with earned gravity. She'd brought a cranberry tart and her first published poem, printed in a local zine. Audrey had read it twice. She would read it again. She moved to pour the wine when Marla paused, squinting across the room. "Is that new?" she asked, pointing to a frame propped at the end of the buffet. Audrey followed her gaze. It was a photo of herself, taken at the workshop's summer picnic. She was laughing, head tilted back, a pen tucked behind one ear, the wind catching her sleeve like a sail. Ruth had snapped it on her phone and printed it as a surprise. "First picture of me in my own house," Audrey said simply. Greta grinned. "You look loud in that picture." Ruth raised her glass. "Here's to not whispering anymore." They toasted. The air smelled of cinnamon and roasted garlic. The windows steamed just slightly from the warmth of everything. The house Audrey had made, smaller, messier, freer, felt full. After dinner, while the others moved to the couch, Audrey lingered in the kitchen. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, rinsed a bowl, then saw the envelope. It had arrived that morning, slid beneath her door like an echo. Cream-colored, Harper's handwriting on the front. Inside, a single card. "Hope you're well." That was all. No apology, no reference to last year, no acknowledgement of the call, the confrontation, the court filing. Just civility, postmarked. Audrey didn't feel anger. Not anymore. There was nothing new in the absence, no betrayal in the brevity, just confirmation. She still doesn't see me, Audrey thought, but I'm finally visible. She folded the card and placed it in a drawer, not with resentment, just without ceremony. Later, she brought out coffee and joined the others in the living room, the fire crackling in its usual uneven rhythm. Ruth recited a poem. Marla passed out peppermint bark. Greta laughed until she cried. Audrey sat back, cradling her cup in both hands, her eyes drifting toward the photo on the buffet. I was the silence, she thought. I became the pause that changed everything, and that was enough. What happens when silence becomes a strategy and love demands boundaries? If this story stirred something in you, stay with us. We unpack the unspoken, one page at a time, because the quietest voices often carry the loudest truths. Let's keep listening. Let's keep turning pages.